The Saturday morning market air hung thick with the scent of cider donuts and damp earth, a fragile peace that Agnes Miller cherished. At 76, her movements were a study in deliberate economy, each step measured, each breath a quiet prayer of gratitude for another day. Her canvas tote bags, heavy with potatoes, apples, and a single precious jar of local honey, tugged at the worn fabric of her coat. The weight was a familiar ache in her shoulders, a grounding reality in a world that felt increasingly ethereal. She paused near a stall of vibrant orange pumpkins, adjusting her grip, the murmur of the crowd a comforting hum around her. That hum was abruptly shattered. A young man, all sharp angles and blindingly white sneakers, moved with the predatory confidence of a creature who had never known a moment of self-doubt. He held a phone mounted on a gimbal, his face a rictus of performative excitement for an audience only he could see. "What's up, jet-setters? We're live from this boomer fest, and things are about to get real." His voice was a blade, slicing through the gentle market chatter. His name was Jet, his brand was Chaos, and Agnes was about to become his content. He saw her, a small, gray-haired woman struggling with her groceries, and his eyes lit up with a cruel spark of opportunity. He pivoted, framing her perfectly in his shot. "You see this, fam? This is what happens when you don't evolve. Total system failure." He strode towards her, his followers' digital cheers already echoing in his mind. Without breaking his stride or his monologue, he swung his leg. The pristine white sneaker connected with the bottom of her largest canvas bag. The impact was shockingly solid. Potatoes rolled like dull cannonballs across the asphalt, scattering into the legs of the crowd. Apples, crisp and red, bounced and bruised. The jar of honey, her one small luxury for the month, arced through the air in a perfect, tragic parabola before shattering on the ground, its golden contents pooling around shards of glass like crystallized sunlight. For a heartbeat, the market fell silent. Then, a few nervous titters rippled through the onlookers. Phones, which had been documenting quaint farm stands and artisanal cheeses, slowly turned towards the scene. The lenses were cold, impartial, hungry. Agnes stood frozen, not from shock, but from a profound, sinking wave of humiliation that felt colder than the autumn air. She looked down at the ruin of her week's shopping, the wasted pension money, the scattered pieces of her quiet dignity. Jet loomed over her, his phone capturing her stunned face. #epic fail. #boomerpocalypse. He crowed to his invisible legion. "Smash that like button if you think Grandma needs to get with the program." No one moved to help. They just watched, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light of their screens, passive observers to a casual act of cruelty. Agnes slowly, stiffly, bent down to retrieve a single unblemished apple, her world reduced to the small circle of her shame. Jet circled her like a shark, his phone a predatory eye. "Look at her, jet-setters. No fight, no spirit. This is the generation that ruined the economy, and they can't even carry their own groceries." His voice dripped with a manufactured disdain that played well with his target demographic. He zoomed in on her face, on the fine web of wrinkles around her eyes, on the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for a potato. "What's the matter, Grandma? Lost your government handout?" A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. It wasn't outrage. It was a mixture of discomfort and morbid curiosity. A few teenagers snickered, nudging each other. A middle-aged man in a fleece vest shook his head but kept his distance, his reluctance to get involved a tangible force field around him. The systemic indifference was a heavy blanket, smothering any potential spark of compassion. They were not participants. They were consumers of a spectacle. Agnes said nothing. To respond would be to validate him, to become a character in his pathetic drama. She simply continued her task, her movements slow and aching. She reached for the waxy green peel of a cucumber that had rolled near his foot. As her fingers brushed against it, he deliberately kicked it away, sending it skittering under a nearby stall. "Whoops! Butterfingers!" he jeered, winking at his phone's camera. "You gotta be quicker than that, sweetheart. It's survival of the fittest out here," the digital comments, visible on his screen's overlay, scrolled in a rapid, venomous stream. "LL Jet, you're a savage." Owned. She probably deserved it. Each word was a tiny, invisible stone thrown from a great distance. The farmer at the pumpkin stall, a man with hands like gnarled oak roots, opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. Getting involved with someone like Jet was bad for business. A confrontation would draw more attention, more trouble. It was easier, safer to look away. And so he did, turning to rearrange a stack of gourds with feigned interest. This small act of cowardice was, in its own way, more cutting than Jet's overt cruelty. It was a confirmation of her invisibility, a verdict that her dignity was worth less than a moment of inconvenience. Agnes felt the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on her. It wasn't just this boy and his phone. It was the wall of silent witnesses who, by doing nothing, became his accomplices. They were denying her worth, erasing her humanity, and turning her pain into disposable entertainment. She could feel their eyes on her, not with sympathy, but with a detached pity that was even more insulting. They saw a frail, pathetic old woman, a victim. They didn't see the steel in her spine, forged over a lifetime of hardship. They didn't see a survivor. They saw only what the boy with the camera wanted them to see. A joke. Her heart ached not with self-pity, but with a deep, sorrowful disappointment in the world that was unfolding around her. As she knelt on the cold asphalt, the sharp edges of gravel pressing into her knees, her mind retreated from the jeers and the silent stares. It went to a quieter, warmer place. It went to Arthur, her husband of 52 years, gone now for 3. He wasn't a large man, but he had a presence that could fill a room, a steadiness that had been her anchor through every storm. He'd been a Marine, a corporal who served 2 tours in a jungle whose name most people could no longer pronounce. He rarely spoke of the war, but its lessons were etched into the way he lived his life. She remembered one evening years ago, after a particularly condescending banker had denied them a small loan for a new roof. She had come home in tears, feeling small and powerless. Arthur hadn't offered empty platitudes. He'd simply taken her hand, his own calloused and warm, and said, "Aggie, they can take your money, they can take your time, they can even take your roof, but they can't take your dignity unless you hand it to them. It's the one thing you own outright. Don't ever let them have it for free." That principle had become the bedrock of her existence. Dignity wasn't about pride or defiance. It was about holding onto the core of who you were when the world tried to strip you bare. It was about quiet resilience. It was about knowing your own worth even when no one else acknowledged it. Arthur had taught her that. He had seen her strength when she herself had doubted it, and his belief in her had become her own. Her small apartment, just a few blocks from the market, was a shrine to that quiet strength. The walls were filled not with expensive art, but with framed photographs of a life well lived. Arthur in his dress blues, impossibly young and serious. Their son, Michael, on a tricycle, his face smeared with chocolate. A faded picture of the 3 of them on a beach, squinting into the sun. Every object held a story, a testament to love and loss and endurance. The pension she lived on was meager, but she managed. She volunteered twice a week at the local soup kitchen, the very place for which half of these spilled groceries had been intended. Giving back was another of Arthur's principles. "You don't have to have much to have enough to share," he'd say. This memory, this connection to Arthur, was her shield. As she picked up a bruised pear, she wasn't just a humiliated old woman. She was Agnes Miller, Arthur's wife, a woman who had weathered far worse storms than a petulant boy with a camera. She would not cry. She would not scream. She would not give him the satisfaction. She would simply endure, collect what she could, and walk away with her head held high, because her dignity was not his to take. It was a legacy, a promise she had made to the man whose memory she carried in her heart. The strength she now drew upon was not her own. It was theirs, woven together over half a century of shared life. The pressure intensified. Jet, sensing his audience's fleeting attention span, knew he needed to escalate. The passive humiliation wasn't enough. He needed a reaction. "Come on, Grandma," Show us some emotion. Are you even alive in there? He crouched down, thrusting the phone inches from her face, the wide-angle lens distorting her features into a grotesque caricature. The jet-setters want a show. Give us a tear. Just one. The circle of onlookers tightened. The initial discomfort had morphed into a kind of trance-like fascination. They were no longer just watching. They were participating in a digital mob, their silent presence providing the backdrop Jet required. A young woman with pink hair, who had been filming from the start, muttered to her friend, "This is so messed up." But she didn't lower her phone. The compulsion to document, to capture the moment, overrode the impulse to intervene. The silence was no longer passive. It was an active choice, a collective decision to let this happen. Agnes reached for the shattered honey jar, a shard of glass nicking her finger. A single drop of blood, bright red against her pale skin, welled up. She stared at it, a tiny, vivid point of pain in a sea of numb humiliation. Jet saw it too. "Ooh, we've got blood, people. This is next-level content," he exclaimed, zooming in on her hand. "Is she gonna cry? Place your bets in the chat right now." She felt a tremor run through her, a deep, primal urge to scream, to lash out, to shatter his smug composure. But then she saw Arthur's face in her mind's eye, his calm, steady gaze. "Don't hand it to them, Aggie." She took a slow, deliberate breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She wrapped the small cut with a tissue from her pocket and continued her work, her movements becoming even more precise, more focused. She was building a wall around herself, brick by brick, with every potato she placed back in her bag. The crowd felt it. They felt the shift in her posture, the unwavering set of her jaw. This wasn't the behavior of a victim. It was something else, something they didn't understand. Her endurance was becoming an indictment of their passivity. Her silence was louder than Jet's incessant chatter. She was holding a mirror up to them, and they were beginning to see their own unflattering reflections. The pressure in the small clearing of the market was immense, a taut, invisible membrane stretched to its breaking point. And Agnes was the calm, unmoving center of it all. Amidst the wall of unseeing adults, a small boy, no older than 7, stood clutching his mother's hand. He wasn't filming. His wide, brown eyes were fixed on Agnes, and they were filled with a pure, uncomplicated horror. He saw not a boomer or content, but a grandma, like his own, being hurt. When Jet kicked the cucumber away from Agnes's reach, the boy's face crumpled, and a heartbreaking sob escaped his lips. "Mommy, why is that man so mean? Make him stop." His mother, a woman who had been watching with a conflicted expression, shushed him, her face flushing with embarrassment. "It's not our business, honey. Let's go." She tried to pull him away, to retreat back into the anonymity of the crowd. But Agnes saw him. Through her own haze of pain and humiliation, she saw this child's distress. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. Her focus moved from her own suffering to his. She saw his innocence being tarnished by the casual cruelty he was witnessing, and a deep, protective instinct rose within her. This was more important than her spilled groceries, more important than her wounded pride. Ignoring Jet, ignoring the silent, staring crowd, she slowly got to her feet. She looked through her bag and found the one perfect apple she had managed to salvage, its skin a deep, glossy red, unbruised and whole. She wiped it carefully on her coat sleeve until it shone. She took a step towards the boy, her movements gentle, non-threatening. The mother tensed, ready to pull her son behind her. Agnes held out the apple. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but clear, cutting through Jet's obnoxious narration. "It's all right, little one," she said, her eyes only on the boy. "Don't you worry. It's just a silly game grown-ups play sometimes." She offered him a small, tired smile, a gesture of profound grace in the face of abject ugliness. "This is for you. It's a good 1 inch. The boy looked from the apple to her face, his tears slowing. He reached out a small, hesitant hand and took it. He held it like a treasure. This small, selfless act was a lighthouse beam in the fog. It was a sacrifice of sorts, giving away one of the few things she had left from her shopping, but more than that, it was an act of pure, unadulterated kindness. It was a declaration that even in the depths of her own public humiliation, her first instinct was to comfort a child. It was an action so fundamentally decent that it shattered the cynical narrative Jet had been spinning. It was quite simply a moment of unassailable dignity. That simple, quiet act of giving the apple to the crying child was a stone dropped into the still, murky pond of the crowd's conscience. The ripples spread instantly. A woman standing near the front lowered her phone, the screen going dark. She looked at Jet, her expression curdling from passive interest to active disgust. "That's enough," she said, her voice low but carrying in the sudden lull. "Leave her alone." Jet, momentarily thrown off his rhythm, scoffed. "Mind your own business, Karen. We're making art here." But the spell was broken. The boy's mother, who had tried to pull him away, now stood frozen, shame coloring her cheeks. She looked at Agnes, who was now turning back to her scattered belongings, and saw not a pathetic victim but a figure of immense strength and grace. The mother gently pushed her son forward. "Say thank you," she whispered. The boy clutched the apple and mumbled a shy, "Thank you, ma'am." Whispers began to snake through the crowd. "Did you see that?" He kicked her food, and she gave that kid her apple. What a monster! The tide of opinion, so easily swayed by Jet's brash confidence, was now turning against him with breathtaking speed. The phones, which had been pointed at Agnes, now pivoted towards Jet, the lenses no longer impartial but accusatory. The collective gaze shifted from victim to perpetrator. The farmer from the pumpkin stall finally found his voice. "Hey, you've made your point. Now clear off before I call the cops." His voice was gruff, but it held a new note of protective anger. Others murmured their assent. The wall of silent complicity had crumbled, replaced by a low, growing rumble of communal outrage. They had been shown their own cowardice by the quiet courage of a 76-year-old woman, and the sight was not a pleasant one. They had watched a man bully an elder, and their inaction now felt like a stain. Agnes's simple act of kindness had reminded them of a moral code they had momentarily forgotten, and the whispers of respect for her began to drown out the fading digital cheers for her tormentor. Then came the sound. It started as a low, guttural rumble, a vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. It was a sound that didn't belong amidst the cheerful clatter of a farmer's market. It grew steadily, a deep-throated growl that seemed to shake the very asphalt. Heads turned, searching for the source. The rumble swelled into a thunderous roar as two, then four, then a dozen motorcycles turned the corner onto the market street. They were Harleys, heavy and black and chromed, moving with a slow, deliberate menace. Atop them sat men who seemed carved from granite and leather. They wore cuts, sleeveless leather vests, adorned with patches that left no room for ambiguity. The death's head insignia of the Hell's Angels was stark and unmistakable. They weren't passing through. They were arriving. The lead rider, a man with a chest as broad as a barrel and a beard that flowed over the front of his vest like a grizzled waterfall, raised a single gloved hand. The procession came to a halt, the engines dropping to an idling, syncopated growl that filled the air with a palpable tension. He swung a leg over his bike, his boots hitting the pavement with a solid thud. He was an immense presence, a mountain of a man who moved with an unnerving, fluid grace. His nickname, stitched on a patch over his heart, was Grizz. He and his brothers had been at the far end of the market, at a small coffee stand run by a veteran they supported. They had seen the whole thing unfold, their initial irritation turning to a cold, simmering fury. They had watched Jet's cruelty, the crowd's passivity, and Agnes's quiet, unbreakable dignity. They had waited, observing, their code dictating that they not interfere unless a line was crossed. The kick, the taunts, the humiliation, that was the line. Agnes's subsequent act of kindness to the child was the final verdict. The crowd parted for them as if by instinct, a sea of fleece vests and tote bags receding from the tide of black leather. The bikers formed a loose, intimidating semicircle, their backs to Agnes, facing Jet and the now silent onlookers. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their presence was a statement, a physical manifestation of a different, older set of rules. The air crackled. Jet's smirking bravado began to falter, the color draining from his face as he finally registered that the situation had spun completely out of his control. The Brotherhood had arrived. Jet, desperate to reclaim control of the narrative, tried to play it off for his dwindling live audience. Whoa, look who it is, Jet-setters. The real-life sons of anarchy. Here to back me up. He aimed his phone at Grizz, a fatal miscalculation. Grizz didn't even glance at him. His eyes, chips of ice under heavy brows, scanned the scene. The spilled groceries, the broken honey jar, and Agnes, standing small and still behind him. He walked past Jet as if he were a piece of furniture and stopped in front of the pumpkin farmer. His voice was a low rumble, like gravel turning in a cement mixer. What happened here? The farmer, no longer hesitant, straightened up. He pointed a thick finger, not at Jet, but towards Agnes. That woman there, he said, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction, is Agnes Miller. Comes here every Saturday. Buys more than she needs. I asked her about it once. She takes it down to that homeless shelter on Elm Street. The one the city cut funding for. Does it with her pension money. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Her husband, Arthur, was a Marine. Did 2 tours. A real man. Another biker, a wiry man with shadow stitched on his vest, stepped forward. His face was grim. Arthur Miller? I knew Art. Served with my old man. The man was a legend. Quiet, tough as nails. Would give you the shirt off his back in a blizzard. He looked over at Agnes, his hard expression softening with a flicker of recognition and deep respect. That's Art's wife. The truth, delivered in these plain, unvarnished testimonies, landed with the force of a physical blow. The crowd, who had seen only a frail old woman, was now confronted with the reality of a quiet hero, a woman of immense character and generosity who had been sacrificing for their community in silence for years. The story recontextualized everything. The spilled groceries were not just food. They were meals for the hungry. The humiliation was not just an attack on an individual. It was an insult to a veteran's widow, a desecration of a legacy of service and sacrifice. The reveal hung in the air, thick with the shame of the onlookers and the cold, righteous anger of the bikers. Grizz absorbed this information with a slow nod. The final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. He turned, his movements deliberate, and walked towards Jet, who was now visibly trembling, his phone held loosely in his hand like a useless talisman. The live stream was still running, broadcasting Jet's terrified face to the world. Grizz didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply reached out and plucked the phone from Jet's grasp. With his other thumb, he navigated the screen with surprising dexterity, found the End Live button, and pressed it. The digital eye that had fueled the entire ordeal was closed. The connection was severed. Jet was alone, stripped of his audience, his power, his shield. Grizz then held the phone for a moment before dropping it to the pavement, where he crushed it under the heel of his boot with a sickening crunch of plastic and glass. He turned his back on the whimpering influencer. "Shadow," he rumbled. "Clean this up." It wasn't a request. It was an order that set a dozen men into motion. The bikers, these intimidating, hardened men, descended upon the scattered groceries. They moved with a surprising gentleness, their large, calloused hands carefully picking up every last potato, every bruised apple. They swept up the broken glass. But they didn't just restore what was lost. They improved it. Shadow walked over to the pumpkin farmer. "Give us 2 of everything she had. The best you've got." He pulled a thick roll of cash from his pocket and peeled off several bills, pressing them into the farmer's hand. "And for your trouble," the farmer, his face a mask of awe, began packing a new box for Agnes. The bikers went from stall to stall, a wave of black leather and rumbling voices, buying fresh bread, new honey, crisp vegetables, paying for it all from their own pockets. The other vendors, witnessing this, refused to take their money, instead adding items to her bags as a form of penance and respect. When they were done, Agnes's 2 worn canvas totes had been replaced by 5 sturdy boxes, overflowing with the market's best offerings. They brought them to her, setting them down gently at her feet. Then Grizz did something that made the entire market hold its breath. He unzipped his cut, the thick leather vest that was his identity, his armor, his flag. It was covered in patches that told the story of his life. Rides, rallies, fallen brothers. It was a sacred object. He took it off and, with a reverence that was almost tender, draped it over Agnes's small, stooped shoulders. It swallowed her frame, the heavy leather smelling of road dust, gasoline, and brotherhood. He leaned in close, his voice for her ears alone, though the sentiment was clear to all. "Arthur Miller was a man of honor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And this club honors his memory. No one touches Arthur's wife. Ever. You are protected by us now. You understand." Agnes looked up at the giant of a man, her eyes shimmering with tears she had refused to shed for her tormentor. She could only nod, clutching the heavy vest around her. It was the most profound symbol of respect she had ever received, a shield of honor bestowed upon her by the most unlikely of guardians. The community, shamed into silence, could only watch as true recognition, fierce and loyal, was given. The bikers did not leave her there. The act of restoring her groceries and bestowing their protection was not the end. It was the beginning. Grizz gently took one of the boxes, and Shadow took another. The rest of the men fell into formation around Agnes, a phalanx of leather and steel. "We'll see you home, ma'am," Grizz said, his voice a low, protective rumble. They began to walk, moving slowly to match her pace. The crowd parted before them, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and dawning respect. The phones were gone, put away in pockets, their owners now fully present in the gravity of the moment. They watched the procession. The small, gray-haired woman wrapped in a Hell's Angels cut, flanked by a dozen of the most formidable men they had ever seen, who were now acting as her honor guard, carrying her groceries. As they left the market square and started down the quiet residential street where Agnes lived, the soundscape changed. The bikers who had walked with them returned to their machines. With a coordinated roar, engines ignited, settling into that same deep, rumbling idle. The procession continued, but now it was a motorcade. 2 bikes rode in front, clearing the way. 2 rode on either side of the walking group, and the rest followed behind. The sound was no longer menacing. It was a proclamation. It was a royal escort. Neighbors, drawn to their windows and front porches by the thunderous noise, stared in disbelief. They saw Mrs. Miller, the quiet widow from 3B, the one they exchanged pleasantries with but never truly knew, being escorted by a chapter of the Hells Angels. They saw the deference in the biker's posture, the way they watched the street, scanning for any threat. They were witnessing the public, undeniable securing of her dignity. When they reached her modest apartment building, the bikers carried her boxes up the 3 flights of stairs without a word of complaint. They placed them carefully on her kitchen counter, a mountain of fresh food that would feed the shelter for weeks. Agnes stood in her doorway, the heavy vest still draped over her shoulders. She looked at these men, their weathered faces, their intimidating tattoos, and saw only kindness. I don't know how to thank you," she stammered, her voice thick. Grizz simply nodded, his eyes conveying everything that didn't need to be said. He gently took his vest from her shoulders and put it back on, the familiar weight settling on him like a second skin. "No thanks necessary, ma'am," he said. "We take care of our own. Art was a brother in spirit. That makes you family." He and his men filed out, their boots echoing softly in the hallway. Agnes watched them go, her heart full of a strange, powerful warmth. She stood at her window and watched as they mounted their bikes. Grizz caught her eye one last time and gave her a slow, deliberate nod of respect. Then, with a final, deafening roar that shook the window panes and rattled the pictures on her walls, they were gone. The street fell silent, but the silence was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with the lingering echo of the engines, a resonant promise of protection. Across the street, her neighbors stood on their lawns, no longer just looking, but seeing her for the first time. The community had been transformed. The image of the small, dignified woman, honored by the fierce loyalty of an outlaw brotherhood, was burned into their collective memory. Agnes Miller, Arthur's wife, was no longer invisible. Her respect, earned through a lifetime of quiet sacrifice, was now secured for all to see, carried on the thunder of roaring chrome and the enduring spirit of a brotherhood she never knew she had.